She bought a first-class ticket, but they told her she didn't belong. They humiliated her, forced her off the plane, without realizing they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Because she wasn't just any passenger, she was a billionaire, and now she's about to take revenge in the most unexpected way. Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Vivian Cole stepped out of her sleek black sedan, adjusting the lapels of her navy blue coat as a gust of wind sent crisp leaves spiraling across the sidewalk. She had always preferred understated elegance. No designer labels flashing, no unnecessary displays of wealth. To most passers-by, she could have been any successful professional on her way to work. And that was exactly how she wanted it. The entrance to Le Montclair, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, gleamed ahead, its name embossed in gold against a dark mahogany sign, the kind of place where deals worth millions were made over breakfast, where status was currency, and where unwritten rules about who belonged were rigidly upheld. She approached the host stand, where a young man in a crisp black vest barely looked up before assuming, "Ma'am, the dining area is reserved for members and their guests." His tone was polite, but dismissive, the kind that made her stomach tighten. Vivian exhaled slowly, reaching into her handbag for her phone. "I have a reservation under Cole." The host finally glanced up, his brows knitting slightly as he searched the list. The flicker of realization on his face was almost amusing. Almost. "Ms. Cole, my apologies. Right this way." He led her past linen-draped tables where men in tailored suits exchanged murmured conversations over espresso and newspapers. The scent of freshly baked pastries and oak-aged whiskey hung in the air. Vivian had been in rooms like this countless times, yet the weight of expectation never left. At a private table near the window, Marcus Bennett was already waiting. The sharp-dressed lawyer in a charcoal gray suit greeted her with a warm nod, his dark eyes assessing. "I was starting to think you'd finally had enough of this place." Vivian gave him a knowing smirk as she took a seat. "Tempting, but we both know these are the circles we have to play in." A server approached, noticeably more attentive than the host. "Would you like coffee, Ms. Cole?" The shift in treatment was predictable. The moment her status was confirmed, so was her worth in their eyes. "Black, no sugar," she replied, then turned back to Marcus. "Tell me something good." Marcus leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "The deal with Stern Investments is moving, but they're hesitant. They think our firm might be stretching too fast, too soon." Vivian inhaled deeply. The same concerns, the same hesitation. People always questioned when someone like her expanded too quickly, as if waiting for her to stumble. "They're wrong," she said, her voice even. "We've built Cole Capital on solid ground. The numbers back us up." Marcus studied her for a moment. "You ever get tired of having to prove it?" Vivian stirred her coffee, watching the steam rise. "I stopped expecting fairness a long time ago." Their conversation was interrupted by the faint chime of her phone. She glanced at the screen, her assistant's name flashing urgently. She picked up. "Vivian, I just got word. We need you in San Francisco by tomorrow. Helton Group is ready to finalize, but they want your presence in person." She pressed her lips together, calculating. Helton Group was the key to expanding her firm's influence on the West Coast. This was a move she couldn't afford to miss. "I'll be there," she said, then ended the call. Marcus raised a brow. That sounded important. More than important. She picked up her coffee, taking a measured sip. "It's the kind of deal that changes everything." And somewhere in the back of her mind she wondered, how many more doors would she have to push open before they stopped questioning why she was there? Liberty International Airport was a world of its own. Rushed footsteps echoing against polished floors, hurried voices blending into a constant hum. The distant whir of suitcase wheels rolling over tile. Large digital boards flickered with flight updates, while clusters of travelers moved with a shared purpose. Some eager, some exhausted, all navigating the limbo between destinations. Vivian Cole walked past the security checkpoint, her carry-on rolling effortlessly behind her. She had traveled often enough to make the process second nature. Aurora Airways was her usual choice for business flights. Efficient, comfortable, predictable. At least it had always been. The check-in counter for first-class passengers was separated from the economy line by sleek gold stanchions, marking the distinction between those who paid for luxury and those who merely traveled. Vivian handed her passport and ticket to the attendant, a young man in a crisp navy blue uniform who barely glanced at her before typing into his computer. His fingers hesitated for a beat too long. "Ms. Cole," he said finally, his tone polite but clipped, "I'll need to verify your identification again." Vivian blinked, shifting her weight slightly. "You already have my passport." The attendant offered a tight smile, the kind that came with rehearsed explanations. "It's just a routine security check. I appreciate your patience." She didn't miss the way two passengers, both white, both businessmen in tailored suits, walked past the counter without so much as a second glance from the staff. They exchanged a few words with the attendant, chuckled, and were promptly handed their boarding passes. Vivian exhaled slowly. The irritation wasn't new. It was just tiresome. "Of course," she said, her voice steady. She slid a second form of ID across the counter. The attendant barely examined it before nodding, suddenly efficient again. "You're all set, Ms. Cole. Enjoy your flight." She didn't respond. She simply took her boarding pass and walked toward the Aurora Airways VIP lounge, where polished marble floors gleamed under soft lighting. A server passed by with trays of champagne and miniature pastries. The air smelled of fresh espresso, leather seats cradled hushed conversations, and financial newspapers were neatly stacked beside glass coffee tables. Vivian settled into a seat near the window, checking emails on her phone, but her mind lingered on the moment at check-in. It wasn't outrage. It was the quiet weight of repetition. A boarding announcement interrupted her thoughts. "Aurora Airways Flight 317 to San Francisco is now boarding first-class passengers." Vivian made her way through the private boarding lane, stepping onto the plane with the ease of familiarity. Her seat, 2A by the window, was spacious, with plush leather and a folded white linen napkin waiting on the armrest. She placed her carry-on in the overhead compartment, adjusted her coat, and sat down, exhaling as she settled in. Then came the presence. A shadow crossed into her space. Vivian glanced up. The woman standing beside her, Gretchen Adler, the lead flight attendant, wore the Aurora Airways uniform with a stiffness that seemed less about professionalism and more about an inflated sense of authority. Her blonde bob was styled into precise waves, her eyes coldly assessing. Vivian knew that look. "Ma'am," Gretchen said, her smile not reaching her eyes, "I believe you might be in the wrong seat." Vivian met her gaze evenly. "No, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." A pause. The kind of pause meant to test whether someone would second-guess themselves, whether they would shrink back or stand their ground. Vivian reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out her boarding pass, holding it up between two fingers. Gretchen's eyes flickered toward it, but she didn't take it. Instead, she pursed her lips. "I'm sorry, but we have a strict image to uphold. We need to maintain the exclusivity of our premium services." Vivian blinked once, twice. Then she let out a quiet breath through her nose, tilting her head slightly. "What exactly are you implying?" A silence stretched between them, the kind that made nearby passengers shift in their seats, ears perking. A few turned their heads slightly, just enough to eavesdrop, but not enough to be involved. One man 2 rows ahead lowered his newspaper, taking in the scene with faint interest. Another woman across the aisle simply looked away, uninterested in whatever confrontation was brewing. Gretchen adjusted her stance, as if physically reaffirming her authority. "I'm just saying," she continued, voice light but pointed, "that first class is designed for a certain level of clientele." A polite phrasing of something far uglier. Vivian's fingers curled around the armrest. She had a choice: make a scene or let it pass. Neither would change the underlying issue. But she had played this game before. She inhaled deeply, forcing her voice to remain calm. "I see. Well, I meet all the qualifications of this so-called clientele. I have a ticket, I have a seat, and unless you're implying something else, I'll be staying right here." Gretchen's expression tightened. A flicker of something passed through her features. Frustration, challenge. Then she turned. "Excuse me for a moment." Vivian's stomach tensed as Gretchen walked toward the front of the cabin. She already knew what was about to happen. Moments later, two uniformed Aurora Airways security personnel entered the cabin. The conversation was over before it even started. One of them, a tall man with a radio clipped to his belt, stepped toward her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice professional but final, "I'm going to have to ask you to deplane." Vivian didn't move. She glanced at the passengers around her. Some had lowered their eyes, pretending not to see. Others watched with mild curiosity, as if witnessing a minor inconvenience rather than something inherently wrong. Her fingers tightened around the armrest. She could argue. She could demand a manager. She could list the company's own policies and regulations. But at that moment, none of it mattered. This wasn't about rules. This was about power. And she was being reminded yet again of who was allowed to have it. Slowly, deliberately, she unbuckled her seatbelt. She stood, gathered her belongings, and as she turned toward Gretchen, who stood near the exit with arms folded, there was no anger in her expression, no outburst, no pleading, only a long, steady look, a look that promised this moment would not be forgotten. Then without a word, Vivian walked off the plane. Vivian sat alone in the VIP lounge, the ceramic cup of coffee growing cold between her hands. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the tarmac stretched under the glow of overhead floodlights, planes taxiing in the distance like silent shadows. The terminal hummed with muffled conversations, but she barely heard them. The weight of what had just happened pressed against her ribs, a slow, simmering burn beneath her skin. She had spent a lifetime enduring moments like this. Subtle slights, microaggressions, the unspoken suggestion that she did not belong. But this was different. This was deliberate, public, humiliating. Her phone buzzed on the table. Without hesitation, she picked it up and dialed the only person she trusted to be both furious and rational. "Marcus," she said the moment he answered. The deep timbre of his voice came through the line. "Vivian, what happened?" She took a slow breath, steadying herself. "They pulled me off the plane." Silence. Then sharper. "What?" She recounted the events as plainly as possible. Gretchen Adler's condescension, the thinly veiled accusations, the way security had removed her without question, without consideration. Through it all, Marcus listened without interruption, but she could hear his breathing shift, could feel his frustration building. "This is a lawsuit waiting to happen," he said finally. "You need to file a formal complaint with Aurora Airways. Go straight to their corporate office if you have to." Vivian exhaled through her nose. "And then what? They send me an apology email? Offer me a free flight? That's not enough." "Vivian," Marcus's voice was measured but firm, "you're angry and you have every right to be, but you need to be strategic about this." She stared into her untouched coffee, its dark surface reflecting the sharp angles of her face. "Marcus, this isn't just about me." She could hear him shifting in his chair. "What do you mean?" "This isn't the first time they've done this to someone," she said, the realization settling like a stone in her gut. "It's just the first time they did it to me." The words hung between them. She leaned back against the leather seat, gripping the phone tighter. "I want to know how deep this goes. I want to know how many others have been treated like this and how they got away with it." Marcus hesitated, then sighed. "That's a much bigger fight, Vivian." She glanced around the lounge at the businessmen casually sipping cocktails, at the flight attendants laughing near the service station. Life moved on, oblivious. She set her jaw. "Then it's one worth fighting." Marcus muttered something under his breath, then said, "All right, let's start with what we can prove. I'll dig into their records, see if there are any prior discrimination complaints. I also need someone on the inside," she said. "Someone who knows how they operate." There was a pause before Marcus said, "I might know someone." Vivian sat forward. "Who?" "Olivia Park," he said. "She used to work as a flight attendant for Aurora, left under questionable circumstances." Vivian's mind worked quickly. "Can you get me in touch with her?" "I can try." Marcus hesitated. "But if you're serious about this, you need to be prepared. They're not just going to let you expose them without a fight." Vivian's fingers curled around her coffee cup, the ceramic warm against her palm. "Good," she said quietly, "because I'm not planning on losing." 2 hours later, she sat in a private corner of an upscale bar near the airport. nursing a whiskey neat. Marcus had worked fast. Olivia Park had agreed to meet. Vivian recognized her immediately when she walked in. Mid-30s, petite, sharp eyes that took in the room with careful calculation. She hesitated at the entrance before striding over, sliding into the seat across from Vivian. "So," Olivia said, crossing her arms, "you want to know the ugly truth about Aurora Airways?" Vivian met her gaze. "I think I already do. I just need proof." Olivia huffed a quiet laugh. "Proof?" She shook her head. "That's the problem. They're careful. Complaints disappear. People who speak up suddenly find themselves reassigned or fired." Vivian studied her. "Is that why you left?" Olivia's expression flickered. "Let's just say I got tired of watching people like Gretchen get away with it." A pause. Then Olivia exhaled, tapping her fingers against the table. "All right, I'll tell you what I know. But if you're planning to take them on, you better be ready for war." Vivian lifted her glass, the amber liquid catching the light. "Then let's get started." 2 weeks had passed since the humiliating incident on Flight 317. The initial sting had dulled, but the fire inside Vivian had only grown. She sat in her office at Cole Capital, the skyline of New York City stretching beyond the glass walls. Papers, reports, and printouts cluttered the mahogany desk between her and Marcus. The air smelled of freshly brewed coffee, the faint hum of the city below providing a steady rhythm to their quiet focus. Marcus flipped through a thick stack of legal documents, shaking his head. "This is worse than I thought." Vivian leaned back, her arms crossed. "How bad?" He exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "Aurora Airways has had at least a dozen formal discrimination complaints filed against them in the past 5 years. But here's the thing. None of them ever made it to court. Either they were settled quietly or dismissed altogether." Vivian's fingers tapped against the desk. "How does that happen?" "Money, influence, connections." Marcus gestured toward a file. "Richard Caldwell has been running this company like his own private kingdom. Every time an issue arises, it disappears before it gains traction." She picked up one of the reports, scanning through the details. "So he's been burying these cases before they can do real damage." "Exactly," Marcus said. "And it's not just the discrimination complaints. The company has a history of questionable labor practices, too. Employees who speak out don't last long." Vivian frowned. "So that means Gretchen wasn't acting alone. She was following orders." Marcus nodded. "It's systemic. This isn't about one bad employee. It's about a company that created a culture where this kind of behavior thrives." Vivian let out a slow breath. She had known this wasn't just about her. But seeing the evidence laid out in front of her, the sheer number of complaints that had been ignored or covered up, it made her stomach tighten. Marcus set the papers down and leaned forward. "Listen, if you want to take this to court, we have a case. It won't be easy, but we can fight them legally." Vivian didn't answer right away. She stared out the window, her mind racing. Taking Aurora Airways to court would make headlines, sure. It would expose their practices. But would it really change anything? She turned back to Marcus. "I want to meet with people who've worked there, people who've seen this firsthand." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You want to go deeper?" "I want to understand exactly what I'm dealing with," she said. "If we're going to take them down, I need to know everything." Later that evening, Marcus arranged a meeting in a private lounge of an upscale restaurant in Midtown. The group of people seated around the dimly lit table weren't just any former employees. These were people who had been forced out, silenced, or ignored. Vivian scanned the faces, men and women, all carrying the weight of their experiences. Some looked wary, others resentful. They had all been part of Aurora Airways at one point. Now they were survivors of its system. Olivia Park sat at the end of the table, her expression tight. This was the first time Vivian had seen her since their initial meeting. Marcus cleared his throat. "All right, let's get to it. You all worked for Aurora. We know there's a pattern of discrimination, but we need proof." A former flight attendant, a woman in her early 40s, spoke first. "I filed a complaint after a supervisor made inappropriate comments about my accent. A week later, my schedule got cut in half. When I brought it up again, they found a reason to fire me." Another man, a former operations manager, added, "They have a playbook for this. They never fire anyone outright. They make the environment unbearable until you quit. Vivian listened, absorbing every detail. The pattern was undeniable. Then Olivia spoke. It's bigger than that. Everyone turned to her. Vivian leaned in. Explain. Olivia's jaw tightened. I worked under Gretchen for 2 years. She wasn't just some power-hungry flight attendant. She had backing from above. Caldwell and the executives knew exactly what she was doing. Hell, they encouraged it. They wanted first class to maintain an image. Vivian's stomach twisted. You're saying the discrimination was policy? Olivia gave a dry laugh. Not officially, of course. But inside, yeah, it was understood. There were lists of undesirable passengers. They used excuses, dress code, conduct, vague security concerns. A cold anger settled in Vivian's chest. This wasn't about one bad experience. This was a deliberate system of exclusion. Olivia reached into her bag and pulled out a USB drive. She placed it on the table and slid it toward Vivian. What's this? Vivian asked. Olivia's eyes were steady. Emails, reports, internal documents, everything I saved before I left. Marcus picked up the drive, examining it. If this is what you say it is, this changes everything. Vivian exhaled, her mind spinning. Marcus sat back. So, do we take it to court? Vivian shook her head. No. He frowned. Then what? She looked at him, determination settling in her bones. I'm going to buy them out, she said. I won't just expose them. I'll own them. A stunned silence filled the room. Then Marcus let out a slow chuckle, shaking his head. Vivian, you are a dangerous woman. She picked up her whiskey glass, her grip firm. Good, she said, because they have no idea what's coming. 3 weeks had passed since Vivian was pulled off Flight 317. 3 weeks since she decided she wasn't just going to expose Aurora Airways, she was going to take it. The air inside Coal Capital's headquarters carried a quiet hum of activity, a stark contrast to the storm brewing beneath the surface. Vivian stood by the massive windows of her office, watching the city stretch out below her, a skyline of power and ambition. The weight of what she was about to do pressed against her ribs, but she welcomed it. Behind her, Marcus dropped a thick folder onto the table. It's not impossible, he said, loosening his tie, but it won't be easy. Vivian turned, crossing her arms. Nothing worth doing ever is. Marcus rubbed the bridge of his nose. You're talking about a multi-billion-dollar acquisition, Viv. Aurora Airways isn't just some struggling company looking for a buyer. They're entrenched. Their biggest shareholder is Genesis Holdings, and we both know who's pulling the strings there. Richard Caldwell. The name alone carried weight. Chief Executive Officer of Genesis Holdings. A man with deep political connections, media influence, and an iron grip on Aurora Airways. He had built a career out of making problems disappear, whether that meant lawsuits, scandals, or people. Vivian pulled out a chair and sat, flipping open one of the documents. We can't take them head on. That's why we go in quietly. Marcus exhaled, dropping into the seat across from her. So what's the play? She tapped the paper in front of her. We don't buy Aurora Airways outright. We chip away at it, bit by bit. Using Coal Capital and a network of smaller funds, we start acquiring shares. Nothing big enough to draw attention at first, just enough to plant the seeds. Marcus nodded slowly. So by the time Caldwell realizes what's happening, we'll already be in too deep. Exactly, she said. By then we'll have enough leverage to force a takeover or make him come to us. The plan was ruthless, calculated, but it had to be. Still, it wasn't just about money. She needed insight, weaknesses in their operations, areas of vulnerability. So she had started assembling a team, not just financial experts, but people who knew the airline industry inside and out. Former executives, analysts, even a few disgruntled employees who had once been loyal to Caldwell's empire. Marcus leaned back, studying her. You've really thought this through? Vivian met his gaze. I don't fight battles I'm not prepared to win. 2 weeks into the plan, the first ripples began to appear. Inside Aurora Airways headquarters, Richard Caldwell sat at the head of a long mahogany table, surrounded by his board of directors. The air in the room was thick with tension, the kind that lingered when something unseen was shifting beneath the surface. One of the senior executives cleared his throat. We've noticed an unusual pattern in the market. Caldwell raised an eyebrow. Define unusual. The man slid a report across the table. Over the past 2 weeks, there's been a steady increase in our stock purchases, but not from a single entity. It's coming from multiple investment firms, small independent funds. Caldwell scanned the numbers. On the surface, the movement seemed harmless, but something about it felt calculated. He set the paper down, his expression unreadable. Who's behind it? The executive shifted uncomfortably. That's the problem. They're all different firms. No obvious connection. A flicker of something cold passed through Caldwell's chest. He wasn't the kind of man who left things to chance. He had spent years making sure Aurora Airways was insulated from outsiders, from people who thought they could change the way things were run. This question mark. This smelled like a challenge. He leaned back, fingers steepled under his chin. Find out who's behind it, he said, voice smooth but sharp, and shut it down. Back at Cole Capital, Vivian sat in a dimly lit conference room, a map of the financial strategy spread across the large screen. The numbers were moving in the right direction. Slowly, methodically, their stake in Aurora Airways was growing. Marcus scrolled through a report on his tablet. Caldwell isn't stupid. He's going to figure out something's happening. Vivian didn't look up. Let him, Marcus smirked. You really want him to come looking? She took a slow sip of her coffee, then finally met his gaze. I want him to realize too late that he's already lost. Richard Caldwell sat in his office on the top floor of Genesis Holdings, the sprawling skyline of Chicago stretching out behind him. The room was a statement, floor-to-ceiling windows, deep mahogany furniture, and an air of quiet dominance. He had built this empire with precision, ensuring that no one could challenge him without consequence. But now something was shifting beneath him. A thick folder lay open on his desk, filled with reports from his financial analysts. The numbers were subtle at first, just a few fluctuations in stock ownership. But then came a pattern. Shares of Aurora Airways were being bought up by independent funds, all seemingly unconnected. Yet when traced back far enough, one name surfaced. Cole Capital. His jaw tightened. This wasn't coincidence. This was an attack. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin, as a slow, knowing smirk played at the corner of his mouth. So, she thought she could play in his arena? Fine. Let's see how long she could survive. He picked up his phone and pressed a button. Get me Vivian Cole, he said smoothly. Vivian arrived at Genesis Holdings headquarters the next afternoon, stepping into a world of calculated luxury. The lobby was a monument to power, high ceilings, gleaming marble floors, and the kind of silence that only existed in places where money spoke louder than words. She was led to the executive suite without delay. Caldwell had made sure she felt expected, but she knew better than to mistake hospitality for goodwill. When she stepped into his office, he was already standing, a well-rehearsed smile stretching across his face. Ms. Cole, he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Please, have a seat. She took it without a word, crossing her legs and meeting his gaze evenly. Caldwell studied her for a moment before leaning forward, his elbows resting on the desk. I have to admit, he began, voice smooth as glass, I didn't expect you to be quite this bold. Vivian arched an eyebrow. Bold? Cole Capital, he said, flipping the folder shut with a soft thud. I assume you didn't think I'd notice? She didn't blink. I assumed you'd notice eventually. Caldwell chuckled, shaking his head. I don't know what game you think you're playing, Ms. Cole, but Aurora Airways is not for sale. Vivian tilted her head slightly. Everything has a price, Mr. Caldwell. Even companies built on outdated values. The amusement in his eyes flickered, just for a second, replaced by something colder. Let me be clear, he said, his tone sharpening. I built this company. I've kept it thriving despite every challenge thrown its way. You think you can just walk in, throw some money around, and take it from me? Vivian rested her hands on the armrests, her voice unwavering. I don't think, Mr. Caldwell. I know. Silence stretched between them, taut and crackling. Then Caldwell leaned back, his smirk returning, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. You really don't understand what you're up against, do you? He mused. Aurora Airways isn't just another company. It's an institution. And institutions don't fall because one woman decides she doesn't like how they're run. Vivian didn't flinch. They do when that woman is determined enough. Caldwell's confidence wavered, just slightly. He masked it well, but she saw it. The brief flicker of uncertainty, the smallest crack in his composure. Then he stood, signaling the meeting was over. I'll give you credit, Ms. Cole. You have ambition, but ambition isn't enough to change the rules of the game. Vivian rose to her feet, adjusting the cuffs of her blazer. That's where you're wrong. I'm not here to play your game. She turned, walking to the door. But just before stepping out, she paused, glancing over her shoulder. I'm here to rewrite the whole damn thing. And then she left. Caldwell remained motionless for a moment, staring at the closed door. Then slowly he sat back down. A muscle in his jaw twitched. This was no ordinary businesswoman. She wasn't just here for a power move. She was here to dismantle him. He exhaled sharply, pressing the intercom on his desk. Get the legal team in here. Now, he ordered. Then he reached for his phone, dialing a number that was already burned into memory. Start preparing the media campaign, he said, voice calm but laced with steel. I want every outlet we own running stories by the end of the week. Make her look reckless. Make her look dangerous. He leaned forward, his fingers tapping against the desk. She wants a fight? Let's give her one. A week had passed since Vivian's meeting with Richard Caldwell. She had expected retaliation, but even she was impressed by how quickly and ruthlessly he moved. Aurora Airways wasn't just fighting back. It was waging war. The first signs came subtly. Whispers in the financial world, sudden hesitations from potential investors. People who had previously expressed interest in backing Cole Capital's quiet accumulation of shares were now reluctant to be associated with her. Calls that used to be answered on the first ring suddenly went to voicemail. Then the media campaign began. Headlines splashed across major business news outlets, turning a strategic acquisition into a smear campaign. A radical takeover? Is a financial mogul trying to destroy a prestigious airline? Corporate greed versus tradition, the fight for Aurora Airways. News anchors speculated on the aggressive nature of Vivian's investments, questioning whether she was attempting to dismantle an industry giant for personal gain. Opinion pieces painted Caldwell as a guardian of legacy and stability, while Vivian was framed as an outsider recklessly trying to force her way into a world that didn't belong to her. At first, she merely observed. She had been through this before, seen how power worked in the financial world, how narratives could be manipulated. But when she read an article that claimed she had a history of questionable financial practices, implying that Cole Capital's success was built on unethical tactics, her blood ran hot. She tossed the newspaper onto her desk and turned to Marcus, who stood across from her, arms crossed. They're not just attacking my business strategy, they're attacking me. Marcus nodded, his face tight with anger. They're trying to make you the villain before you even get close to the finish line. Caldwell knows he can't fight you in a boardroom, so he's fighting you in the court of public opinion. Vivian exhaled slowly, her jaw clenched. That's a mistake. Marcus leaned forward. Vivian, we need to respond. Issue a public statement. Push back against this narrative before it sticks. But she shook her head. That's what he wants. He wants me to fight this in the press, to get tangled in a PR war. If I do that, I'm playing on his terms. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts, her mind already moving ahead. I need to move faster. Marcus frowned. Faster how? She looked up at him, determination settling in her eyes. We're going straight to the source. I want to talk to the people who actually matter, the board members. While the media storm raged on, Vivian worked in silence. She knew that not everyone within Aurora Airways leadership supported Caldwell. Some had tolerated him out of necessity, others had grown frustrated with his leadership, but lacked the power to challenge him. Those were the people she needed. One by one, she began reaching out. Some were hesitant to take her calls, worried about the optics of being seen talking to her. Others were more receptive, their curiosity outweighing their fear. A handful of them were already unhappy with the direction Caldwell had taken the company. She met with them discreetly in private clubs, executive lounges, and quiet corners of high-end restaurants. She listened more than she spoke, letting them voice their frustrations, letting them admit, often in hushed tones, that Aurora Airways had problems Caldwell could no longer ignore. And then she planted the seed. What if there was another way, she asked them. She didn't push, didn't demand. She simply left the idea hanging in the air, giving them space to consider the possibility of change. The first few meetings were cautious, but slowly, momentum built. Meanwhile, at Aurora Airways headquarters, Caldwell was starting to feel an unfamiliar sensation creeping in. Unease. He sat in his office, his fingers drumming against the desk as he reviewed the latest reports. The PR team had done their job, shaping the media narrative against Vivian. The legal team was already preparing contingency plans in case she took an aggressive approach. But there was something he hadn't accounted for. Some of his board members, people who had once been firmly under his control, were changing. A few had suddenly gone quiet, no longer as eager to support his strategies. Others had started asking questions in meetings, questioning financial decisions they had previously ignored. It was subtle, but Caldwell had been in this game long enough to recognize when something was shifting beneath him. Someone was getting to them, and he had a pretty good idea who. He leaned forward, pressing a button on his intercom. "Get me a full report on all board members," he said. "I want to know where they've been, who they've met with, and what conversations they've been having." There was a pause before his assistant responded. "Understood, sir." Caldwell exhaled, his jaw tightening. This wasn't just about defending his company anymore. This was war. The boardroom at Aurora Airways headquarters in Chicago was designed to command authority. The polished walnut tables stretched across the room, framed by towering windows that overlooked the city skyline. The walls bore the weight of decades of power, portraits of past executives, symbols of longevity, of tradition. Richard Caldwell entered the room with the air of a man who had already won. His steps were deliberate, his expression composed. He had spent the past few weeks tightening his grip on the company, rallying allies, shutting down dissent. He believed he had successfully framed Vivian as an outsider, an opportunist who threatened the very foundation of Aurora Airways. He took his seat at the head of the table, glancing at the faces around him. The usual expressions of deference and agreement greeted him. But there were cracks, a few uncertain glances, the slightest hesitation in some of the board members' postures. It was small, but Caldwell had built his career on reading people. He knew when control was slipping. The meeting began with routine discussions, financial reports, operational updates. But then came the shift. Henry Thornton, a longtime investor and one of the most respected voices in the room, cleared his throat and leaned forward. His silver hair gleamed under the recessed lighting, his fingers tapping against a printed report. "I've been reviewing the financial reports," he said, his voice measured but firm, "and I have serious concerns about how this airline is being managed." Silence. Caldwell turned his gaze toward Thornton, keeping his expression neutral. "Concerns?" Thornton nodded. "Our stock has been fluctuating unpredictably. Investor confidence is slipping. And let's not ignore the growing scrutiny from the media and the public. These aren't isolated issues, Richard. They're symptoms of a deeper problem." A ripple of unease passed through the board. Caldwell felt it. He smiled thinly. "We're in the middle of a hostile takeover attempt, Henry. That's what's causing the instability. A smear campaign by people who don't understand the airline industry." Thornton didn't flinch. "Or maybe it's because our leadership is failing to address real concerns. Maybe it's because our company has been protecting policies that don't belong in this century." The air in the room tightened. Caldwell's fingers curled slightly around the armrest of his chair. And then, the moment he had been waiting for arrived. Vivian stood. She had been silent until now, watching, listening. But now all eyes turned to her. She adjusted the cuffs of her blazer, her movements slow, deliberate. When she spoke, her voice was steady, carrying the weight of certainty. "I'd like to formally present an offer to acquire Aurora Airways." A sharp intake of breath from someone at the table. Caldwell's grip on his chair tightened, but he said nothing. Vivian let the statement settle before continuing. "I'm not here just to talk numbers," she said, stepping forward slightly. "I'm here because this company is broken, and it's not just about financial mismanagement. It's about something deeper, something systemic. She reached into the leather folder in front of her and pulled out a stack of documents. These, she said, sliding them across the table, are internal reports from former employees, emails, testimonies. They paint a picture of a company that has fostered discrimination, that has silenced those who spoke up, and that has prioritized exclusion over innovation. A hushed murmur spread through the boardroom. Some members exchanged uneasy glances. Others leaned forward, scanning the documents with cautious hands. Caldwell's jaw tightened. "This is absurd," he said, forcing a laugh. "Anonymous accusations? You expect this board to entertain—" "They're not anonymous," Vivian interrupted. She turned slightly and the door behind her opened. Olivia Park stepped in, her posture straight, her expression unyielding. A former employee, a direct witness. Vivian watched the shift in the room. She could see the discomfort, the realization creeping into some of their faces. Caldwell had built an empire on control, on fear, on silencing dissent before it could grow. But now, the silence was breaking. "You can deny it," Vivian said, looking directly at Caldwell, "but you can't stop the truth from coming out." Caldwell didn't have a response ready. A long, heavy pause filled the space between them. Then, one of the younger board members cleared his throat. "I think," he said carefully, "we need to discuss this further. In private." Vivian saw it, the hesitation, the doubt. She had planted the seed. Caldwell straightened in his chair, his mask slipping just slightly. His eyes locked onto hers, and she saw something new in them. Uncertainty. He knew what was happening. He knew the board was starting to consider another possibility. But she also knew something else. Caldwell wasn't the kind of man to lose gracefully. She had forced him into a corner, and now she had to prepare for what came next. Because Caldwell wasn't going to fight fair. The lights of Chicago flickered through the windows of Aurora Airways headquarters, casting long shadows across Richard Caldwell's office. The air was thick with the scent of burnt espresso, the remnants of a long and bitter day. He stood by the glass, his reflection staring back at him, jaw tight, mind racing. Vivian Cole had backed him into a corner. The board was cracking. She had them questioning him, hesitating where they once followed without doubt. And worse, she had played her hand in a way he hadn't predicted. She wasn't just after his company. She was after his legacy. He turned back to the room where his most trusted advisors sat, his legal team, PR strategists, and corporate security heads. The air was tense. He could feel the unease rolling off them. They weren't used to seeing him on the defensive. "Enough is enough," he said, his voice controlled, but laced with steel. "She wants to play hardball? Fine. Let's remind her what happens when you step into a game you don't belong in." One of the PR executives cleared his throat. "We've already ramped up the media response. The latest headlines are pushing the narrative that she's an outsider trying to dismantle a long-standing American institution." Caldwell nodded, but his eyes were already on the next move. "That's not enough. We need to dig, find something, anything, that we can use against her." The room fell silent for a beat. Then his head of security, a man named Weston, leaned forward. "You're talking about a full-scale background check? That could take time." Caldwell shook his head. "I don't need time. I need results." His chief legal officer, a sharp-eyed woman named Ellen Mercer, spoke next. "Richard, you know the risks of this. If we go too far—" "There is no too far," Caldwell interrupted. "She came after me. She embarrassed me in my own boardroom. That woman doesn't get to walk away unscathed." Weston exchanged a glance with Ellen, then exhaled. "All right, we'll start digging." Caldwell stepped toward the table, placing both hands on its smooth surface. "Find something, a questionable deal, a lawsuit, a rumor. It doesn't have to be true, it just has to be loud enough." The room fell into motion. Calls were made. Emails were sent. Caldwell knew how this worked. He had buried scandals before, but this time he was doing the opposite. He was about to create one. 2 days later, the first hit piece went live. Vivian Cole, a ruthless financier or a corporate bully? The article painted her as a reckless investor, someone who had built her empire by preying on struggling companies and gutting them for profit. It hinted at past business dealings that were questionable without actually presenting evidence, just enough doubt to make people nervous. Then another article followed. The woman who wants to tear down aviation. Does Vivian Cole understand what she's getting into? It framed her as arrogant, suggesting she had no real experience in the airline industry and was simply looking to dismantle a company out of personal vendetta. Then came the real hit. A third article appeared, this time with a fabricated accusation. A supposed insider claiming that Vivian had engaged in unethical business practices years ago. It was vague enough to avoid immediate legal repercussions, but sensational enough to dominate the news cycle. And just like that, the tide began to shift. At Cole Capital, the impact was felt almost immediately. Vivian stood in her office, phone in hand, as Marcus paced in front of her desk, frustration evident in every movement. "This is bad," he muttered, flipping through his tablet. "Investors are getting nervous. I've had 3 major clients call today asking about these articles." Vivian didn't respond right away. She had expected Caldwell to retaliate. What she hadn't expected was how quickly and ruthlessly he would move. "They're fabricated," she finally said. "We can disprove them." Marcus scoffed. "You think that matters? It's not about truth, Vivian. It's about perception. These headlines don't need to be real. They just need to make people question you." She exhaled through her nose, setting her phone down. "How bad is the damage?" Marcus rubbed his temple. "It's not catastrophic, but it's serious. Some of our institutional partners are holding off on deals until this blows over. A few board members we were courting? Suddenly less enthusiastic." Vivian leaned against her desk, crossing her arms. "And Caldwell?" Marcus gave a humorless chuckle. "Oh, he's thriving. The man's a master at weaponizing the media. His PR team is making him look like a defender of tradition, while you're the greedy outsider trying to disrupt everything." Vivian stared out the window, her jaw tightening. She had been in tough fights before, but this was different. Caldwell wasn't just fighting a business war. He was coming for her reputation, for her credibility. She turned back to Marcus. "All right," she said. "We need to counter this." Marcus folded his arms. "You thinking PR pushback?" Vivian shook her head. That's his game. If we respond with press statements, we're reacting, not controlling." She grabbed her tablet and pulled up a list of Aurora Airways' largest shareholders. "If we can't stop the media storm," she said, "we go around it." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" Vivian's gaze was steady. "Meaning we cut off his power at the source. Caldwell still controls the board, but if we get to the right people, the shareholders who actually matter, he won't have a company left to manipulate." Marcus let out a slow breath. "That's risky." "So is letting him dictate the terms of this war," she shot back. She turned to her desk, pulling out a folder. Inside were names, financial records, corporate alliances, everything she had been gathering in the background. "He thinks he's winning," she said quietly, flipping through the pages. "He thinks he can drag me down before I can take him out." She closed the folder and met Marcus's gaze. "He's wrong." The storm hit harder than Vivian expected. She had weathered media scrutiny before, speculation, rumors, even outright attacks on her business acumen. But this was different. This was orchestrated. Caldwell hadn't just smeared her reputation. He had turned the entire industry against her. Inside Cole Capital's headquarters, the tension was palpable. The usually smooth flow of business had turned chaotic. Emails flooding in from concerned investors, phone calls from partners demanding reassurances, whispers among staff about whether the firm could survive this. Vivian stood in the middle of it all, phone in hand, scrolling through the latest headlines. Cole Capital in crisis. Investors flee amidst leadership controversy. Has Vivian Cole overplayed her hand? The woman who wanted to buy an airline, now fighting to save her own company. She placed the phone face down on her desk, inhaling deeply. Across from her, Marcus Bennett leaned against a chair, arms crossed, his expression serious. "We need to stop," he said simply. Vivian looked at him, her gaze unreadable. "Stop what?" "This," he gestured broadly, frustration seeping into his tone. "The takeover, the fight with Caldwell. You've seen the fallout. Investors are pulling out. We're hemorrhaging credibility. Vivian exhaled, pressing her fingertips to her temples. Marcus, I know why you're doing this, he cut in. I know what happened on that plane wasn't just about that one moment. But right now, you're gambling with everything you've built. His voice softened, just slightly. Are you sure this is worth it? Silence filled the space between them. For the first time since this battle began, doubt slithered into Vivian's mind. Had she pushed too far? Had she let this fight become personal when it should have been strategic? The logical part of her told her to step back, to regroup, to live to fight another day. But then, I used to think people like me didn't have a choice. Olivia Park's voice broke through her thoughts. Vivian looked up. Olivia stood in the doorway, her eyes dark with something deeper than anger. Conviction. I thought if I kept my head down, did my job, ignored what was happening around me, things would get better. She shook her head. But they never did, and they never will. Not unless someone forces them to change. Vivian held her gaze. Olivia took a slow breath. If you back down now, nothing will ever change. The words settled deep inside Vivian. She had spent years proving herself in a world that constantly questioned whether she belonged. She had played by the rules, climbed her way to the top without ever giving them a reason to push her back down. But now she had the chance to rip those rules apart. Her decision was made. She turned back to Marcus. We're not stopping. Marcus let out a slow breath. That's risky. So is letting him dictate the terms of this war, she shot back. She turned to her desk, pulling out a folder. Inside were names, financial records, corporate alliances, everything she had been gathering in the background. He thinks he's winning, she said quietly, flipping through the pages. He thinks he can drag me down before I can take him out. She closed the folder and met Marcus's gaze. He's wrong. The storm hit harder than Vivian expected. She had weathered media scrutiny before. Speculation, rumors, even outright attacks on her business acumen. But this was different. This was orchestrated. Caldwell hadn't just smeared her reputation, he had turned the entire industry against her. Inside Cole Capital's headquarters, the tension was palpable. The usually smooth flow of business had turned chaotic. Emails flooding in from concerned investors, phone calls from partners demanding reassurances, whispers among staff about whether the firm could survive this. Vivian stood in the middle of it all, phone in hand, scrolling through the latest headlines. Cole Capital in crisis, investors flee amidst leadership controversy. Has Vivian Cole overplayed her hand? The woman who wanted to buy an airline, now fighting to save her own company. She placed the phone face down on her desk, inhaling deeply. Across from her, Marcus Bennett leaned against a chair, arms crossed, his expression serious. We need to stop, he said simply. Vivian looked at him, her gaze unreadable. Stop what? This, he gestured broadly, frustration seeping into his tone. The takeover, the fight with Caldwell. You've seen the fallout. Investors are pulling out. We're hemorrhaging credibility. Vivian exhaled, pressing her fingertips to her temples. Marcus, I know why you're doing this, he cut in. I know what happened on that plane wasn't just about that one moment, but right now, you're gambling with everything you've built. His voice softened, just slightly. Are you sure this is worth it? Silence filled the space between them. For the first time since this battle began, doubt slithered into Vivian's mind. Had she pushed too far? Had she let this fight become personal when it should have been strategic? The logical part of her told her to step back, to regroup, to live to fight another day. But then, I used to think people like me didn't have a choice. Olivia Park's voice broke through her thoughts. Vivian looked up. Olivia stood in the doorway, her eyes dark with something deeper than anger. Conviction. I thought if I kept my head down, did my job, ignored what was happening around me, things would get better. She shook her head. But they never did, and they never will, not unless someone forces them to change. Vivian held her gaze. Olivia took a slow breath. If you back down now, Nothing will ever change. The words settled deep inside Vivian. She had spent years proving herself in a world that constantly questioned whether she belonged. She had played by the rules, climbed her way to the top without ever giving them a reason to push her back down. But now she had the chance to rip those rules apart. Her decision was made. She turned back to Marcus. "We're not stopping." Marcus let out a slow breath. "Then what's the plan?" Vivian picked up her phone. "We go public." 2 days later, the press conference was held at one of the most prestigious venues in New York City. The room was packed. Journalists, business analysts, former employees of Aurora Airways who had once been silenced. Vivian stood at the podium, composed, ready. She cleared her throat. "Thank you all for being here." Flashes from cameras lit up the room. The murmurs died down as she continued. "Aurora Airways has spent years building an image of prestige, of exclusivity," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "But what they've really built is a system that thrives on exclusion, discrimination, and fear." She turned toward the large screen behind her. "Let me show you what I mean." One by one, the evidence appeared. Internal emails discussing ways to quietly remove undesirable passengers from first-class cabins. Documentation of complaints from employees who had been retaliated against for speaking up. Legal records of settlements, discrimination cases that had been paid off, swept under the rug before they could reach the public eye. Gasps echoed through the room. Vivian looked directly into the sea of cameras. Aurora Airways has operated like this for years, and Richard Caldwell has ensured that anyone who challenges him is silenced. Her hands rested on the podium. But today, that ends. The journalists erupted with questions. Reporters scribbled frantically. The public narrative had changed. No longer was Vivian Cole the outsider threatening an airline. Now she was the woman exposing the truth. She could already picture Caldwell's reaction. And that made her smile. Across the country in his Chicago office, Caldwell watched the live broadcast in silence. The blood drained from his face as the documents were shown. He heard the gasp of his PR chief, saw the tense posture of his legal team. Caldwell felt something he hadn't felt before. Panic. He slammed his fist against the desk. "Get me a response," he barked. "Now!" But even as his team scrambled, he knew this wasn't over. Vivian Cole had backed him into a corner. Now it was his turn to fight dirty. Vivian Cole had spent years navigating the financial world, mastering the art of power and patience. But the past 48 hours had been something else entirely. The moment her press conference ended, the story exploded. CNN ran a primetime segment dissecting her claims against Aurora Airways. The New York Times published an investigative piece, pulling records from past lawsuits that had mysteriously disappeared. On NBC, analysts debated whether this scandal could spell the end of Caldwell's reign. And then came the markets. By noon the next day, Aurora Airways stock had plummeted by 12%. Investors were panicking. Analysts were questioning whether the airline could recover from such a damning revelation. Shareholders, many of whom had stood by Caldwell for years, were suddenly looking for an exit strategy. Vivian sat in her office, watching the numbers shift on the screen in front of her. She had expected damage, but not this fast. Marcus paced behind her. "You've got them on the ropes," he said, half in disbelief. She glanced at him. "So does Caldwell." Because if there was one thing she knew about powerful men like Richard Caldwell, it was this: they don't go down quietly. Inside Aurora Airways headquarters, Caldwell was already moving. The boardroom was filled with tense, tired faces. Lawyers, PR specialists, high-level executives who had survived decades under his rule. But today, they all carried the same thing in their expressions: fear. Caldwell slammed his palm against the table. "I don't want excuses. I want solutions." One of his top legal advisors cleared his throat. "We have two primary options: settle with Cole quietly or fight her publicly." Caldwell scoffed. "We don't settle. We destroy." The plan had to be aggressive. Vivian Cole had built her reputation on credibility, so Caldwell needed to make people question it. Step 1. Attack legally. "We file a defamation lawsuit against her," Caldwell said, his voice sharp. "Accuse her of fabricating evidence, of maliciously damaging the company's reputation." A younger lawyer hesitated. "Sir, that might draw more attention to the allegations." Caldwell shot him a look. "Then make it loud. The more complicated it gets, the more people will tune out. Step 2, buy time." He turned to his political lobbyists. "Call in favors. Make sure the government investigation into Aurora gets slowed down." If he could delay any official consequences long enough, people would forget. Step 3, flip the narrative. "We hold a press conference tomorrow," he continued. "We paint her as the problem, an outsider trying to tear down an American institution for her own gain." He leaned forward, his eyes dark. "I want her reputation in flames by the end of the week." The next day, Caldwell stood in front of a podium, cameras flashing around him. "This is nothing more than a coordinated attack," he declared, his voice thick with controlled anger. "Vivian Cole and her associates are spreading false and misleading information to manipulate public perception." He gestured toward the gathered reporters. "Aurora Airways has served millions of customers with dignity and respect. We stand by our record, and we will fight these baseless accusations with every legal measure available." The message was clear. Vivian wasn't a whistleblower. She was a power-hungry opportunist trying to destroy a company for personal gain. And for a moment, it worked. Some media outlets shifted their tone. Analysts questioned whether Vivian had an ulterior motive. Her inbox filled with messages from nervous investors, some urging her to back down before things escalated further. Marcus stood in her office later that evening, rubbing his temples. "We expected this," he admitted, "but damn, he plays dirty." Vivian didn't respond right away. She sat still, processing. Caldwell had fought back exactly as she predicted, but she wasn't done yet. She reached for her phone and made a call. "Set up a meeting with our legal team," she said. "We're taking this to court." Marcus blinked. "We're actually filing the lawsuit?" "Yes," she said. "We're not just going after him in the media. We're going after him in the system." The next morning, Vivian met with a team of civil rights lawyers. The case wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every employee who had suffered under Aurora's discriminatory policies. They filed a class action lawsuit. That same afternoon, the headlines shifted again. "Vivian Cole strikes back. Aurora Airways hit with major discrimination lawsuit." Civil rights groups joined case against Aurora Airways. The battle for Aurora, is this the end of Richard Caldwell? Then the unexpected happened. Vivian received a private message. Not from an anonymous source, not from a journalist, from inside Aurora Airways, a board member. She met with him that evening in a quiet, dimly lit hotel lounge. The man was older, his hands shaking slightly as he passed her a folder. "You need to see this," he said. Vivian opened it. Inside were documents, emails, financial statements, all pointing to one undeniable fact. Aurora Airways had been actively covering up workplace discrimination for over a decade. This wasn't just about one bad policy. This was systemic corruption. And at the center of it all, Richard Caldwell. Vivian closed the folder, her heartbeat steady, her mind already racing ahead. 4 weeks had passed since the battle erupted into public view. What had started as a scandal had now grown into a full-blown federal investigation. The FAA, alongside the Department of Justice, had officially launched a probe into Aurora Airways, investigating allegations of systemic discrimination and unethical business practices. News segments dissected every angle. Analysts debated the company's survival, and shareholders, once unwavering in their support of Richard Caldwell, were beginning to crack. The pressure had reached a boiling point. Inside his private office at Aurora Airways headquarters, Caldwell stared at the television screen, watching his empire unravel in real time. The latest broadcast flashed headlines that made his stomach tighten. "Aurora Airways under federal investigation. Will Caldwell be forced out?" Leaked emails suggest CEO knew about discriminatory practices for years. Major shareholders consider new leadership amid growing scandal. He grabbed the remote and turned off the screen. His jaw clenched. The walls were closing in. And then, his phone rang. He already knew who it was before answering. "Henry," Caldwell said flatly. On the other end of the line, Henry Thornton, a longtime investor and one of Aurora's most influential shareholders, sighed. "Richard, we need to talk." 2 hours later, Caldwell sat across from Henry Thornton in one of Chicago's most exclusive private clubs. Henry was a man who had spent decades in the world of corporate power plays. He was deliberate, calculating, and right now, he looked like someone who had already made up his mind. "I'm going to be direct with you," Henry said, placing a thick folder onto the table. "This is the end of the road." Caldwell leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You've been listening to her too much." Henry didn't flinch. "I've been listening to the facts." He tapped the folder. "Emails, reports, testimonies from former employees. Everything points to one thing. You knew. You didn't just allow discrimination in this company. You orchestrated it." Caldwell's fingers curled against the table's edge. "This is business, Henry. We protected the brand." "No, Richard." Henry's voice was sharp now. "You protected yourself. And now, there's no coming back from this." A long silence stretched between them. Caldwell could feel his pulse in his temples. "Tell me what you want," he said finally. Henry exhaled, shaking his head. "It's not what I want. It's what the board wants." He looked Caldwell straight in the eye. "They're voting to remove you immediately." Caldwell let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You think I'm just going to walk away?" Henry stood, buttoning his jacket. "You don't have a choice." And with that, he left. Caldwell remained seated, his grip tightening around his whiskey glass. He had lost. The boardroom was silent as Caldwell walked in. This wasn't like before. There was no deference in the room, no silent understanding that he was in charge. The air was thick with finality. Across the table, Vivian sat calmly, hands folded in front of her. She had no need to speak. She had already won. The chairman cleared his throat. "Let's get straight to the point." A large screen at the end of the room flickered on, displaying a collection of documents, the leaked emails, the evidence, the undeniable proof that Caldwell had enabled and covered up years of discriminatory practices. One of the board members looked Caldwell directly in the eye. "Mr. Caldwell, are you going to deny these documents?" Caldwell glanced at the screen, then back at the faces staring him down. He could try to argue, he could try to salvage something. But he knew there was no coming back from this. A slow smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "You're all cowards," he muttered. "Every single one of you." No one reacted. The chairman simply sighed. "Let's proceed with the vote." One by one, hands were raised. A unanimous decision. "Effective immediately," the chairman said, "Richard Caldwell is removed as CEO of Aurora Airways." Caldwell let out a breath and stood up. No goodbyes, no last words. Just like that, his entire career was over. As he stepped out of the boardroom, the flashes of cameras blinded him. Reporters swarmed the entrance. Microphones shoved toward his face. But he said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Back in her office, Vivian poured herself a glass of whiskey and stared at the skyline. She had done it. Richard Caldwell was gone. Aurora Airways was on the verge of a massive transformation, and soon she would be the one in charge. But as she took a sip, she couldn't shake a thought from her mind. She had fought against power, corruption, and greed. But now, she was about to step into that very world herself. The boardroom of Aurora Airways was filled with a new kind of tension. Caldwell was gone, his name already fading into corporate history. But in his absence, a power vacuum had formed. The fate of the company was now in the hands of the very people who had once followed his lead. And at the center of it all sat Vivian Cole. She had fought tooth and nail to get here. But as she looked around the room, she realized winning the battle was only the beginning. The real war was just starting. The chairman cleared his throat. "Ms. Cole, as the largest shareholder, you have the right to nominate the next CEO of Aurora Airways. Do you have a candidate in mind?" Vivian leaned back in her chair, folding her hands together. She could feel the weight of every gaze in the room. To her left, a group of younger, progressive board members looked at her with expectation, waiting to see if she would push for radical change. To her right, the old guard sat stiffly, their faces unreadable, but she could feel the tension radiating from them. She already knew what they wanted. They weren't here to argue about ethics or fairness. They were here to protect their investments. And that meant keeping Aurora Airways as it had always been, a powerful, exclusive, untouchable institution. The chairman adjusted his glasses. "Ms. Cole?" Vivian glanced at Marcus, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. She took a breath. I intend to take on the role myself, she said. The silence that followed was deafening. One of the older board members, a man in his 60s with silver hair and a neatly pressed suit, cleared his throat. Ms. Cole, while no one denies your business expertise, Aurora Airways is a complex operation. It requires leadership with industry experience. Marcus scoffed. You mean someone from the old system? The man's jaw tightened. I mean someone who understands how to run an airline. Vivian kept her voice steady. And yet, the people who have run this airline for the last decade nearly destroyed it. A few murmurs rippled through the room. Let's be honest, she continued. This isn't about experience. This is about whether you trust me to lead this company in a new direction, and you're afraid of what that means. Silence. Then another voice spoke up. We are afraid. Vivian turned toward the speaker, Michael Langley, a senior executive who had kept mostly quiet until now. This company has operated in a very specific way for years, he admitted, and yes, some of those ways need to change. But there's a fine line between improvement and chaos. You're afraid I'll change too much, Vivian said. Langley met her gaze. Yes. Vivian let the words settle in the room. Then she nodded. Good. After the meeting, Marcus walked beside her as they made their way down the long executive hallway. You rattled them, he said. That's a good thing. Vivian sighed. Or a dangerous thing. Marcus glanced at her. Are you hesitating? She didn't answer immediately, because the truth was, yes. Vivian Cole had spent her entire career mastering finance, power plays, and strategic takeovers. But now she wasn't just buying an airline, she was expected to lead one, and that was an entirely different battlefield. She stopped in the hallway, pressing a hand to her temple. Marcus, I don't know the first thing about actually running an airline. He studied her for a moment, then smirked. Neither did Caldwell when he started. Vivian shot him a look. That's not exactly reassuring. Marcus leaned in. The difference is, you're willing to learn. He never was. Vivian exhaled slowly. So what's my next move? Marcus shrugged. That depends. Do you want to negotiate with the board to keep them comfortable? Or do you want to break the system? Vivian gave him a long look. You already know the answer. That evening, Vivian met with Olivia Park in a quiet cafe downtown. Olivia, now free from Aurora Airways' grip, had become one of the loudest voices for change. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. This isn't just about replacing the CEO, Olivia said, stirring her tea. It's about changing the entire culture of this company. Vivian nodded. I know. Olivia studied her. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, you're being pushed into a corner. The board wants a leader they can control. The employees want someone who will clean house. The public wants a symbol. She leaned in. But what do you want, Vivian? Vivian hesitated. I want to fix this, she said finally. I want to prove that we don't have to choose between power and ethics. Olivia exhaled. Then you need to be ready, because the second you start forcing real change, the people who are smiling in that boardroom today, they'll be the ones coming for you next. Vivian met her gaze. I'm counting on it. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit private suite, a group of conservative shareholders had gathered. They didn't like where this was going. Vivian Cole was too unpredictable, too willing to shake things up. We need a countermeasure, one of them muttered. We need someone who can convince her to stay in line, another said. And if she won't? The group fell silent until one voice spoke. Then we find a way to remove her. The boardroom was buzzing with low murmurs. The tension was thick, a mix of anticipation and uncertainty hanging in the air. It was a defining moment for Aurora Airways, a moment that would determine its future. Vivian sat at the head of the table, her posture composed, but her mind sharp as a blade. She had fought relentlessly to bring change to this company, and now the next move was hers to make. The chairman cleared his throat. We need to decide on Aurora Airways' next CEO. We have a few names on the table, experienced candidates from within the industry, individuals who understand the complexities of running an airline. A few board members nodded in agreement. Vivian could already tell what they were thinking. They wanted a safe choice, someone predictable, someone who would undo everything she had fought for. Vivian exhaled slowly, then pushed her chair back and stood. I'll take the position. Silence. The entire board turned to her, some in shock, others in barely concealed irritation. The chairman frowned. Ms. Cole, are you saying you wish to nominate yourself? I'm saying I am the best choice, she responded smoothly. Murmurs broke out. A few members exchanged uneasy glances, while others whispered to their colleagues. Michael Langley, one of the more skeptical board members, leaned forward. With all due respect, Ms. Cole, you're a finance expert, not an airline executive. Running an airline isn't the same as running an investment firm. Vivian met his gaze, unwavering. And yet the executives who ran this company before me drove it into scandal, lawsuits, and public outrage. Experience isn't always an advantage when it's been used to maintain a broken system. A younger board member, one who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. What would your plan be, Ms. Cole? Vivian didn't hesitate. I'll take the position as CEO for 12 months, she declared. 1 year. In that time, I will enact sweeping changes to dismantle the toxic culture that has thrived here for too long. A ripple of movement spread through the room. Some board members liked what they heard. Others didn't. Langley shook his head. Vivian, you're talking about gutting the company from the inside. She cut him off. That's exactly what needs to happen. More whispers, more shifting in seats. Finally, the chairman spoke. And if the transition fails? Vivian smiled, but there was steel behind it. Then I stepped down. No golden parachute, no excuses. But if I succeed? She let the weight of her words settle. Then Aurora Airways finally becomes the company it should have been all along. 6 months had passed since Vivian Cole took control of Aurora Airways. The transformation had not been easy. It had been met with resistance, sabotage, and doubt, both from within the company and from the outside world. But now as she sat in her office, overlooking the city skyline, she could finally see the results of her fight. Aurora Airways was no longer the company it had once been. It was something new. The new policies had taken effect, reshaping the airline from the inside out. Customer service training had been completely revamped, ensuring that every passenger, regardless of race, gender, or background, was treated with respect. An independent oversight committee, led by Olivia Park, now reviewed employee conduct, ensuring that discrimination and mistreatment were no longer tolerated. Internal culture shifts were beginning to take root. New hires brought in fresh perspectives, and old employees who resisted change had either adapted or left. Most importantly, the public perception of Aurora Airways was shifting. For years, the airline had been a symbol of exclusivity, catering to a select group while subtly shutting out those who didn't fit the image. Now it was becoming a model for fairness, service, and progress. And people were noticing. A new customer base had emerged, travelers who valued integrity as much as luxury. Aurora Airways had begun to attract diverse, high-profile clients, businesses that aligned with its new vision, and everyday passengers who had once Aurora Airways was growing. Not because of exclusivity, but because of inclusivity. Vivian had changed the game. Michael Stratton was gone. The last remnants of the old regime had finally faded. Vivian had made it clear. There was no place in Aurora Airways for people who still clung to the past. And so, one by one, the remaining senior managers from Caldwell's era resigned or were removed, their influence over the company officially erased. The final announcement came on a quiet Monday morning. Aurora Airways released a public statement confirming its new executive team. Olivia Park was named Chief Customer Service Officer, tasked with ensuring that what happened to Vivian would never happen to anyone else again. The leadership of Aurora Airways reflected the very values it now stood for. Vivian read the press release, allowing herself a moment of satisfaction. She had won. But more than that, she had rebuilt something better. It was a bright, crisp morning when Vivian boarded an Aurora Airways flight for the first time since the beginning of her battle. This time, she wasn't there to fight for her seat. This time, she belonged there. She stepped into the first-class cabin, the same kind of space where she had once been humiliated and forced to leave. But now, as she walked down the aisle, no one questioned her presence. No one hesitated. No one assumed she didn't belong. A young flight attendant approached, her expression warm, professional, and welcoming. "Welcome aboard, Miss Cole," she said with a genuine smile. "Can I get you anything?" Vivian paused for a moment, taking in the significance of what had just happened. She didn't need to prove herself anymore. She didn't need to fight for recognition. She had already won. Vivian smiled, settling into her seat. "No, thank you," she said softly. "I have everything I need." As the plane soared into the sky, Vivian gazed out the window, watching the world below grow smaller. For months, she had been at war, not just with a company, but with a system designed to exclude people like her. Now, as Aurora Airways moved forward into a new era, she understood something even greater. Real power isn't just about winning battles. It's about changing the game entirely. And she had done exactly that. Power isn't just about wealth. It's about the courage to change the system. Vivian Cole didn't just fight for herself. She fought for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And in the end, she didn't just win, she rewrote the rules. But here's the question. If you were in her position, would you have done the same? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories of justice, revenge, and redemption.